And we continue our coverage of today's session of the annual convention of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. We now hear a perspective on the press by a third world leader, featuring the remarks of Prime Minister Kuan of the Republic of Singapore.
Good morning. I am Norman Perlstein, head of the ASNE International Communications Committee and managing editor of the Wall Street Journal. Could I ask you all to stand and pay our respects to Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who has agreed to join us this morning. Thank you very much. It is a privilege to welcome Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore. Mr. Lee was born in Singapore in 1923 and was educated at Raffles College there. He spent the Japanese occupation in Singapore and Malaysia, and from 1946 through 1949 attended Fitzwilliam College at Cambridge University. While in England, he became a barrister of Middle Temple. Mr. Lee returned to Singapore in 1951 and worked as a lawyer there. In 1954, he helped found the People's Action Party, which now controls all but one seat in Parliament. Mr. Lee became Singapore's Prime Minister in 1959. He was one of the Singaporeans who effected Singapore's separation from the Malaysian Federation in 1965. Mr. Lee became Prime Minister of Singapore against a backdrop of riots, hunger, and threats of communist subversion. During his tenure as head of state, Singapore has achieved what many, including the Wall Street Journal, would call an economic miracle. The country is known today for its commitment to free trade and for its annual per capita gross national product of about $7,000, one of the highest in Asia. At the same time, Singapore's attitude toward the press has gained it a less flattering reputation. In October 1986, the Singapore government began a process that cut Time magazine's Singapore circulation to 2,000 copies a week from 18,000. This action followed Time's refusal to print in full an article about political dissent in Singapore, refusal to print in full a letter from the Prime Minister's press secretary protesting a Time article about political dissent in Singapore. Time's full circulation was eventually reinstated several months after the magazine printed the letter in full. Relations with the Asian Wall Street Journal are a bit more complex. During 1986, the Asian Journal printed numerous letters from the Singapore government protesting coverage. In fact, as many letters as were received from government officials of the rest of Asia's nations combined. Nonetheless, in December 1986, the Asian Journal published an article about the prospects for a new Singapore stock exchange designed for trading second-tier stocks. Although it published a response from private persons involved in the project, the journal refused to publish in full a lengthy attack on the article and its author by a high government official. The journal did offer to publish a letter from the official that omitted the attack on the journal reporter and omitted allegations of errors that did not exist. No such letter was forthcoming. Instead, the Minister for Communications and Information declared the journal to be a newspaper engaging in the domestic politics of Singapore and reduced its circulation in Singapore to 400 copies from 5,000 a day. That prompted the journal to editorialize that the Singapore government's decision was a banana republic action beneath Singapore's stature in the world. The journal is challenging the ban in Singapore's courts. On May 26, 1987, Singapore's Minister for Trade and Industry, the Prime Minister's elder son, Brigadier General Lee Hsien Loong, explained Singapore's actions in a speech to an international press group. He said that, to start from first principles, foreign newspapers have no right to circulate in Singapore. Many Western newspapers and magazines do circulate in Singapore, but not as of right. Circulation is a privilege we grant on terms. One term is that they will publish our corrections and rebuttals. Foreign publications may naturally refuse these terms, in which case they can either not circulate here or have their circulation restricted. Singapore has also restricted the circulation of Asia Week, a publication controlled by Time Inc., and in December 1987, after publishing an account of a meeting between the Prime Minister and the Catholic Archbishop of Singapore on detention without trial of Catholic aid workers, the journal's sister publication, the Far Eastern Economic Review, was similarly gazetted. This despite the review's practice of publishing every letter written by myriad Singapore officials. The Prime Minister then added a personal libel suit against the Review in the Singapore courts. Rather than accept the Singapore government's severe limitations on circulation, the Review chose to withdraw all copies from distribution in Singapore and ceased printing the Review there. In response, the Singapore government passed legislation permitting designated persons to copy and distribute pirated copies of the Review so long as advertising material was omitted and no profit was made on the sale. A Singapore labor union is now doing that with government approval. A request by the Far Eastern Economic Review to provide all of its readers with an edition that it would provide was turned down. At the end of last year, American Society of Newspaper Editor President Catherine Fanning, protesting restrictions on the Review, sent a message to Prime Minister Lee which said, "We deplore this action as well as the continuing curbs on the circulation of Asia Week and the Asian Wall Street Journal. The Singapore government continues to take the downward path to repression in its efforts to limit the free flow of information and the free expression of ideas. We believe that this is unhealthy for Singapore, its neighbors, its trading partners, and the world. It is particularly sad that these restrictions are tightening just when other nations, including South Korea and the Philippines, are becoming increasingly democratic. We urge you to lift all such limits on the press immediately." We are most pleased that the Prime Minister has honored us by coming here personally to respond. May I please introduce the Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, one little correction on that recital of facts. We did not refuse the Review application to reproduce copies. They wanted to reproduce 10,000 copies. Others are already reproducing 8,000, so we offered them the balance of the 2,000 copies. They refused. They said either all or nothing. Well, so be it. I would like to respond by taking as read a speech which I had prepared, but omitting the opening passages, because my chairman has very deftly brought us right to the meat of the problem, and I think I should attack the bone. In the U.S., the press enjoys considerable influence in political and public affairs. The U.S. model is particularly important. It represents the ultimate in terms of media freedoms and prerogatives. In March last year, the U.S. State Department explained in an aid memoir to the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs that it deplored the Singapore government's action to restrict the sale of the Asian Wall Street Journal, despite the fact that the journal had refused to publish the Singapore government's reply to an inaccurate report. It was because Americans believed, says the State Department aid memoir, the press should be free to publish or not to publish what it chooses, however irresponsible or biased its actions may seem to be. The logic is that where the media are free, the marketplace of ideas sorts out the irresponsible from the responsible and rewards the latter. I want to point out that the U.S. model is not a universal standard. The media in other countries play different roles. These roles have grown out of their different historical experiences, their political systems, and their national temperaments. They represent equally valid functions which the press fulfills in different environments. A more appropriate model for the Singapore media would be the BBC World Service, which reports events impartially, but provides an interpretation from a definite perspective. In the BBC's case, the point of view of Western liberalism. BBC broadcasts in Singapore on FM 24 hours daily. It was a service meant for the British community, including their troops stationed in Singapore. When they departed in 1971, I personally asked them to continue it as a service to Singaporeans. Another model is the Japanese media. They also stay out of a partisan role in active politics. And they go beyond plain reporting to shape public opinion by helping build up a national consensus on important issues. Now, Singapore's history. It was a British colony. It has no history of a freewheeling, rambunctious press. In fact, if the British did not have press laws which they invoked to prevent the Chinese language newspapers in Singapore from crusading for the Malayan Communist Party in the 1950s and 60s, the Malayan Communist Party would have succeeded in doing to Singapore and Malaya what the Chinese Communist Party has done to China. Singapore's experience has made Singaporeans chary, even suspicious, of any newspaper crusading for causes or policies which people feel should be left to those who are openly in the political arena. When the marketplace contest of ideas has been practiced in many newly independent countries, it has ended in less than happy results. This happened in Sri Lanka and India. Both are heterogeneous, multiracial societies. In both there are intense racial and regional disagreements on important emotional issues such as race, language, and culture. In both a plethora of media propound divergent and incompatible policies, mobilizing sectional constituencies and arousing emotions. In both, the result has been confusion and dissension rather than enlightenment and consensus. Similarly, in the Philippines, before martial law, it was an Asian version of the United States system. The Philippines press enjoyed all the freedoms, but they failed the Filipino people. A wildly partisan press helped Filipino politicians to flood the marketplace of ideas with junk and confuse and befuddle the people so that they could not see what their vital interests were in a developing country. And because basic issues like economic growth and an equitable distribution were seldom discussed and never tackled, the democratic system malfunctioned and President Marcos was able to declare martial law. Fortunately, a miraculous demonstration of people's power in February 1986 saved the country from impending disaster. Thus, whilst the U.S. model of the press is good for the United States, as a universal standard, its applicability has not been proven. Singapore's case is unique, even amongst countries with colonial backgrounds. We do not have one press, but four major ones in four different languages, catering to four different segments of the population. In Chinese, the majority, Malay, Tamil, and English, which is the language of a small, educated British subject class. Each has different key values and worldviews. In the past, the English press took the standpoint of the colonial government. The Chinese press promoted Chinese language, culture, and chauvinism, looking to China for inspiration. The Malay press agitated for Malay rights and privileges and promoted Malay nationalism, identifying itself with the Malay Muslim communities of Malaysia and Indonesia. The Tamil press maintained ties of the local Tamil community with the mother country, Tamil Nadu, in India. Now imagine an island 1/5 the size of Rhode Island, 1/5 the size of Rhode Island, just over 200 square miles, inhabited by 2.5 million people, with over half its adults, first generation immigrants, people born in China, in India, in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, and the rest of the archipelago. 75% are Chinese from 7 major clan and dialect groups, springing from South and Southeastern China. 15% Malays and Indonesians from the archipelago, 10% Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Burmese, and Eurasians. We have never been one community. For decades, we coexisted in separate segments of the island, demarcated by the British for disparate immigrant groups. From these unpromising beginnings, we have had to try to build one nation. But the melting pot was not an option. We have been independent for less than 23 years. Parents are determined to remain the different kinds of Asians they are, and to keep their children that way. We cannot obliterate cultural and religious distinctions between the racial groups. We cannot even try to remove the language differences. Yet we have had to create enough shared values and a single national identity. And it has taken the government many years to get the different races intermingled into new towns as we resettled the population. Gradually, we hope to reconcile these centrifugal trends and to bring the press in the different languages closer together, approximating, however inadequately, one national view. The process has been helped by the adoption of English as a common working language. A new generation of Singaporeans has been educated with English as their first language, a step-mother tongue, if you will. But this has created new dangers and problems. If we lose too much of our original cultures and their value systems, we may lose our bearings altogether. Singaporeans have to be Asians because Singapore is irrevocably a part of Asia. Parents know that if their children take in too much of America and the West daily on TV and in the newspapers, the result will be disorientation because Singapore is not the West. One value which does not fit Singapore is the theory that the press is the fourth estate. And in Singapore's experience, because of our volatile racial and religious mix, the American concept of the marketplace of ideas, instead of producing harmonious enlightenment, has from time to time led to riots and bloodshed. I have this anecdote as a footnote. but my colleague, the ambassador, tells me perhaps I should read it out, because it should not be a footnote for Americans. One example was the Jungle Girl riots in the 1950s. An English woman, journalist, in the Singapore Standard wrote up a human interest story about a Dutch woman who handed her baby daughter to a Malay woman as the Japanese swept through Southeast Asia. After the war, the Dutch mother traced her daughter. In the meantime, she had been brought up as a Muslim. The Singapore Chief Justice, an Englishman then, sent the child to a convent pending his decision on the custody of the child. It was good, colorful journalism in English. Unfortunately, the Malay language press then took up the story from there, and hell broke loose. A Malay girl in a Christian convent, Muslim forcibly being reabsorbed to Christianity. Bloody anti-white riots broke out, and the Singapore police force, mostly Muslim Malays, went inert. In 1 week, 18 were killed, 173 injured, nearly all Europeans. Could it happen today? Because of the resurgence of Islam, the results would be even more disastrous. Recently, in November 1986, barely a year and a bit, Muslim Malaysians in Malaysia mounted demonstrations against Singapore because the President of Israel, President Herzog, was visiting us. It was said that the Singapore government showed a lack of sensitivity for the anti-Zionist feelings of their Muslim neighbors. Reports of these demonstrations in the press and on TV set off similar protests by Muslim Singaporeans in Singapore. Now, the foreign press. We welcome a free flow of information from abroad. It keeps us up to date with developments the world over. Foreign correspondents can and do report us to their domestic readers in America or Europe. In any way they choose. Of course, when they get important facts wrong, we write to correct them. But it does not matter to us what their ideological slants may be. But there is now a new development. Right up to the 1970s, Singaporeans were mainly Chinese educated. The foreign English language newspapers had few readers and little impact. It was Hong Kong-based Chinese language newspapers, pro-communist, which caused the problems. We banned all of them. We had to. In the 1980s, it was a turning point in the electorate of Singapore, from a mainly Chinese educated to now an English educated majority. In 1981, English displaced Chinese, Malay and Tamil to become the language of instruction of all schools and universities in Singapore. Now, the English language carries with it, as I only know too well from my own personal experience, the cultural values of the British and Americans whose civilizations they encompass. But Singapore cannot model itself on America. It does not have the cultural, the historical, or the economic base for an American approach to life and politics. If you put 2.5 million Americans into Singapore, you will come to grief with your neighbors and the rest of Southeast Asia within 6 weeks. At about the same time, in the 1970s and in the early 1980s, new publications like the Asian Wall Street Journal, based in Hong Kong, began to report Singapore daily, not to readers in America or Europe, but to Singaporeans themselves and to the rest of the region. My chairman was kind enough to remind me that he met me in 1976 for the first time because he was the first editor of the Asian Wall Street Journal. It was a new kind of press. It's offshore Singapore press. Western correspondents, primarily Americans, some British, some Australians and New Zealanders and their staff, reporting Singapore as a Singapore newspaper for Singaporeans, not reporting Singapore to America or Europe or Australia. They have become, in fact, domestic Singapore press based offshore, just like the American dollar based in Singapore offshore. Their correspondents act like journalists do in America, and they take sides to determine the outcome of issues under debate. Now, Americans tend to think of Singapore as one of the NICs, newly industrializing countries. But it's very different from Korea, Taiwan, or Hong Kong. They are racially homogeneous speaking peoples, ethnically, linguistically, culturally. They have their own language, their own culture. They are one racial type. And unlike Singapore, English is not the language of the peoples. Not even in British-governed Hong Kong. In these countries, English has to be translated into Korean in South Korea, or Mandarin or Hokkien in Taiwan, or Cantonese in Hong Kong before you can reach the people. And if you have visited these countries, just watch the television channels and you will see almost no English. Switch on in Singapore and you will see more than half of it in English. Now, none of the NICs, or indeed any of our ASEAN neighbors, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, can be penetrated by the offshore English language press like Singapore. A country with the smallest population in Asia, 2.5 million, has the largest single country market for the Far Eastern Economic Review and the second largest for the Asian Wall Street Journal. Now, if you reduce these sales per million of population in the NICS and in ASEAN, and you compare it to Singapore, if you take Singapore as 1, Hong Kong is half, Taiwan is 1/80, South Korea is 1/70, Malaysia is 1/6, Philippines 1/80, Thailand 1/80, Indonesia 1/280. They are not worried what the English language press writes. Their people can't read it. Take the Asian Wall Street Journal. Hong Kong 4/5 to a Singapore 1. But there is no one man, one vote in Hong Kong. It's the British governor appointed by the British government. And I would suggest to the Asian Wall Street Journal that there might be a change in the complexion of the environment when Hong Kong Chinese takes over the self-government or the self-administered region in 1997, or perhaps even before. Taiwan 1/20th, South Korea 1/40, Malaysia 1/14. But the votes are not with the English reading in the towns, but the Malay reading in the countryside. The Philippines 1/40th, Thailand 1/50th, Indonesia 1/30th. Now the position of the Singapore government. Singapore's domestic debate is a matter for Singaporeans. We allow American journalists in Singapore in order to report Singapore to their fellow countrymen. We allow their newspapers to sell in Singapore so that we can know what foreigners are reading about us. But we cannot allow them to assume a role in Singapore that the American media plays in America, that of invigilator, adversary, and inquisitor of the administration. If allowed to do so, they will radically change the nature of Singapore society, and I doubt if our social glue is strong enough to withstand such treatment. For example, few Singapore foreigners are aware that to lessen our intercommunal conflicts, Malays versus Chinese versus Indians, Singapore and Malaysia, both governments ban each other's newspapers and have done so for over 20 years since we separated. The last big Malay-Chinese riots in Malaysia in 1969 sparked off similar riots in Singapore in a matter of days. We are the closest of neighbors. Unfortunately, one country's newspaper reporting what its people, its own people, are doing and saying can cause Malay-Chinese troubles in the other country if it is read there. It appears preposterous. But the reason is simple. The two countries have two different solutions to their not dissimilar interracial problems. And to read of another solution and the implications of that solution causes problems for the other. Now, no foreign television station claims the right to telecast its programs in Singapore. Indeed, you know that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, bars foreigners from owning more than 25% of a TV or radio station. In other words, only Americans can control a business which influences American public opinion. Thus, before Rupert Murdoch purchased the independent TV stations of the Metro Media Group in 1985, he first had to take up U.S. citizenship. That's given me a good idea. I must require the journalists in the Asian Wall Street Journal to take up Singapore citizenship. Now, if a mighty nation of 250 million Americans finds such a safeguard necessary, what about a plastic, unformed, small society like Singapore? As for the U.S. print media, I remember reading in 1976 that the South African Ministry of Information was negotiating covertly to buy the Washington Star to soft-sell apartheid. When the story broke, a storm broke out in Washington and the purchase fell through. Americans were outraged at this South African attempt to soft-sell apartheid in America's marketplace of ideas. But apartheid is patently abhorrent. If, as the State Department wrote to us, the marketplace of ideas automatically separates the good from the bad and rewards the good, why be outraged at South Africans wasting their money trying to propagate and sell the bad when it was doomed to failure? Now, when Americans react in this way, is it surprising that Singapore feels it cannot take chances with the offshore press taking sides in Singapore's domestic debate? I need hardly remind my chairman that circulation in Singapore is a privilege granted by the Singapore government on Singapore's terms. The terms are that they should report us as outsiders for outsiders, i.e., do not become a partisan in our domestic debate. If they do not want to accept these conditions, they do not have to sell in Singapore. Now our disputes with the four press. In the last 1.5 years, we have had to restrict the circulation of Time, Asian Wall Street Journal, Asia Week, Far Eastern Economic Review, all Hong Kong-based publications. Disputes with 3 of them, Time, Asian Wall Street Journal, and Asia Week, have been over our right to reply. All 3 published inaccurate reports. The government wrote to put the facts straight. Time and Asian Wall Street Journal refused to publish the government replies. Asia Week published the reply, but without our consent, tampered with it and attributed doctored version of the letter to a spokesman of the Singapore government. Part of the freedoms that the press has acquired when it goes offshore. The Far Eastern Economic Review published a story which was not only false but also defamatory. I had my press secretary write to them twice. It's a weekly, so there was plenty of time to think it over, to substantiate or to withdraw the allegations. They refused to do it twice, either to substantiate or to withdraw, despite my secretary stating out the facts, countering the allegations they have made, and being ready to prove our side of the story. They left me with no choice but to restrict their circulation. But that was not good enough, because my voters have read of me cheating or conning my archbishop to saying things which he obviously never intended to say, which would lose me a lot of votes with the Catholics. So I have to sue them for defamation, libel, in order that the facts will be litigated, and either I am a liar or the Far Eastern Economic Review is a purveyor of falsehoods. And in Singapore, our cases go right up to the Privy Council in London. These are printed words. They're not orally spoken. There's no question about what was said. There's also no question about what we say took place, because that's also in our letters in print. Now, the government could have simply banned these publications, but it would have been an overreaction. We have never banned any publication other than the communist ones. We try very hard not to, amongst other reasons, to deny these publications the moral high ground that we are afraid of what they say about us. Now, since sales is one of the principal motivation of these journals, we thought it was sufficient if we restrict their sales of advertisements. In fact, we offered the Asian Wall Street Journal the right to sell without advertisements, and they turned us down. The argument was the advertisement is a part of the newspaper. That's also the right. It has the right to circulate. Now, restricting circulation does not deprive Singaporeans of access to information. Once a few hundred copies are available, anyone who needs any information can make a photocopy for himself. Alternatively, he can buy an advertisement-free copy of the journal, since the law, as we have now amended, allows individuals to reproduce and sell copies of restricted journals, provided all advertisements are removed, and the person doing so makes no profits from his service. The whole object of this exercise is a test in wills. Who has the right to publish what in Singapore? That is what it is all about. It's not about copyright. It's not about freedom of the press. It's about the right of a foreign newspaper and its correspondents to participate in Singapore's domestic life. Simple and straightforward. By not allowing these journals to increase their sales, we have achieved some concessions. Both Time and Asia Week, after considerable delay, relented and published the disputed letters in full. So we restored Time's circulation, and in due course will restore Asia Week. And in due course, I hope the Asian Wall Street Journal will see the light and consider it not worthwhile in insisting on a prerogative which requires our consent. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I have not come here to convert you to my point of view, for I know that would be impossible. All I aim to do is to persuade you that the Singapore government's position is not irrational, that we seek no quarrel with the foreign press when we require them to remember that they are observers and not participants in Singapore's domestic politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Lee. The Prime Minister has agreed to take some questions from the floor. Before doing so, let me tell you that copies of his speech as well as some supplementary material will be available outside this meeting hall after this session. Any questions from the floor, please?
Yeah, right here.
And could you please identify your publication as well? Yes.
Jerry Seppo, San Jose Mercury News. Sir, as I understood it, you said that in several Asian countries, a free and rambunctious press, as you called it, has caused problems. And I understood you to say that in the Philippines, in a way, despite a free press from time to time, people power managed to overthrow the Marcos regime. That is different from what I understood. My understanding was that disclosures, in some cases by the American press, printed both here and reprinted in the Philippines, helped stimulate that people power, if you will. Do you not think that a free press helped overthrow the Marcoses?
It would be churlish of me to deny the credit which the American media rightfully claims as its contribution to the disclosures of the Marcos evils. May I express my assessment of what took place? It wasn't the disclosure of these indiscretions or misdoings that brought about the collapse. It was the crack in the plinth on which the Marcos regime based its power, the army. And when the Secretary of Defense, Juan Ponce Enrile, and the Chief of Staff, General Ramos, broke with him, with Colonel Honasan, then people's power came into its own. And when commanders refused to fire on Camp Aquinado, that was the beginning of the end. But of course, Genesis goes back all the way to the American Constitution drafted for the Philippines in the 1930s. But I make bold to suggest that the American style of modeled Filipino press in the years before martial law did not contribute to enlightenment. Yes, George.
George Chaplin, Honolulu Advertiser. Mr. Prime Minister, despite your explanation and rationale, the central fact is that you exercise censorship with an iron hand, starting, by the way, with the local media. and then, of course, going to the publications that you've discussed here from outside. It seems to me that that smacks of the very communist powers that you abhor. India has a largely free press. India is heterogeneous. India is also Asian. Why do you have so little faith in the ability of your people, so well educated, so little faith in their ability to make intelligent judgments on diversity of ideas, on competing news? Putting it very bluntly, why do you have so little trust in anything but what comes across as dictatorship?
I am breathless at the confidence with which the assertions have been made without any facts whatsoever. There are 3,700 publications, foreign produced, in circulation in Singapore, and a population of 2.5 million. But educated. I don't want to go into the intricacies of the Indian media, but I would only like to add that the Indian newspaper editors whom I know and some of whom work in Singapore do not consider that the Indian press is free because they can't buy the newsprint, amongst other reasons, if they get difficult. So it is not that simple and straightforward. When you have a multi-racial, multicultural, multilingual situation, not a multi-racial but a monolingual, monocultural situation, as in the United States, where different groups have joined a majority culture and language, then you have divergent centrifugal forces. Because each language carries with it its own baggage of cultural values, emotive overtones, and worldview. We still have very major newspapers in different languages. The English language newspaper reaches 55–60% of the population. Not quite, I think, of the population under 35, the educated, English educated population. The Chinese newspaper reaches 70%. That's an overlap. The English reading also reads the Chinese press. The Malay reading is a straight, strong 15%. Tamils too. Each language carries its own overtones. Serbo-Croats go to Australia and they carry out their feuds in Yugoslavia, in Melbourne and Sydney. It takes a long time before they become Australians. We have never tried the free marketplace of ideas, even when the British were in charge, and they didn't have one man, one vote. And I'm not going to run this gauntlet of riots and mayhem. I have been in office for now 29 years. I have won 7 general elections since my first in 1959. I think that qualifies me at least to be able to say that I do know Singapore better than the questioner.
I think we have time for one more question, please.
Mr. Prime Minister, I'm Dick Smyser from the Oak Ridger in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and my question concerns the term the third world and whether or not it has outlived its usefulness. I've heard it criticized as being an oversimplification because, as you pointed out in your talk, there are so many differences in third world countries. Do you think it's a term that's still useful?
If we want to be accurate, people now talk in terms of the third and the fourth worlds. There are vast differences between the countries of, say, America and Western Europe and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. There are even vaster differences between America and Western Europe and China, North Korea, Vietnam. There are considerable differences, not as great as, say, with China or Vietnam or North Korea, between America and parts of Southeast Asia. Yes, we are all human beings. Yes, we all need calorific intake. Yes, we need clothes. We need different kinds of clothes for different climates. We need different kinds of homes for different abodes and climatic conditions. We have different histories. We have different perceptions of what our futures are going to be. For the few days that I'm here, I watch your television, I read your newspapers. I may even be beguiled into believing that your issues, which capture the headlines in the nightly TV news, will determine the fate of the world. But I have to shake myself and remind myself that, yes, what America does in a presidential election is going to determine what her policies will be on free trade or protectionism, on providing security for Asia and the Pacific region, policies towards Japan, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan. But ultimately, you are the largest single factor, but not the total equation. It is also what the Russians are going, the Soviet Union is going to do, what kind of China is going to emerge, what the Japanese will do in reaction or in response to the measures which will be taken to make them come back into a trade balance with the U.S., whether their security arrangements with the U.S. will endure beyond the year 2000, if not, what takes its place, how much of burden sharing can there be when they can only go as far as 1, maybe 1.5% of GNP for defense, and if they go beyond that, they'll have the rest of Asia alarmed. So it's going to be a very different world. You can recover your elan, you can stand tall, you can make new breakthroughs into space and high technology. I have to remember that my neighbors are still in the paddy fields, that I am in Southeast Asia, that even a few not skyscrapers, but just a few high-rise buildings in Singapore can become a kind of an affront to rice field cultures. And therefore, it requires a different presentation of our relationships and our role in the region. So, if you ask me, can you classify them into first, second, and third worlds? I say yes, for sake of simplification, but if you want to be accurate, there are many more worlds than 3 or 4. I mean, I meet leaders from many countries from time to time in various conferences. And when I meet the leader from Uganda, I know that I'm meeting somebody whose world has collapsed and may not be put together again for another 100 years. We are not the same, and probably never will be.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Lee. Before adjourning, if I can just make 2 very quick comments. One, as head of the International Communications Committee over the last year, I have worked very closely